Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to get started with this year's AML 101 training for jewelers. I'm delighted to be joined here today by David Vigen of Outlier Compliance Group. Many, if not all, CJA members are dealers in precious metals and stones and have reporting obligations when it comes to anti-money laundering. One of those obligations is to provide training at least annually to staff. Today's training will focus on AML basics, which can be used in addition to your own specific procedures to fulfill your training obligation that is outlined in AML legislation and related guidance. Now, just a quick reminder that if you're using the session today to train staff, you're also required to keep a record, which should include the names of the people who attended the session, the date, and what was covered in the session. David is an anti-money laundering compliance expert and former banker. Outlier Compliance Group has been working with the CJA for a decade, developing compliance resources, providing consulting services, and sharing their expertise with members through sessions like this one. Before I hand it over to David, I encourage you to put any questions you have in the Q&A section. We'll have a question period at the end of the presentation where your questions will be addressed. And at the end of the presentation, we'll also share an email with the materials and a recording of the presentation. So with that, everyone, please welcome David.
Thanks, Elena, and welcome everybody to this year's AML 101 for dealers in precious metals and precious stones. I am David Vigen, co-founder and CEO at Outlier Compliance Group. And for those that are not familiar with us, maybe just a little quick background. We are an AML consulting advisory firm. We've been partners, as Alana said, with the CJA for over 10 years, and we help companies comply with various pieces of legislation, predominantly what we're going to talk about today, which is AML legislation. Get started with some quick disclaimers. So I am not a lawyer, so nothing that I say today should be taken as legal advice. If you do need a legal opinion, you would seek counsel for that. We're going to talk about a government agency, FINTRAC, who is the AML regulator in Canada. I am not a representative of the government, so nothing should be interpreted as an official government statement or position. We are going to take questions at the end, but if you do have questions that are sensitive in nature or have particular confidential information, reach out to me outside of this and we can kind of help you out. Even though we're going to stop the recording, it's better to keep that sensitive information between us. So, and lastly, as Alana said, we will share this information. This deck and the recording will be handed over to members after. And, you know, you're able to use it internally for your own training purposes. And while we love to be accredited for our work, it's not like we're going to send a bunch of lawyers in. So please do use this internally for your training needs. Okay, so we're going to get started with some of the basics. And first off is, what is money laundering? And for those that have taken the training before, it's going to be repetitive, but again, as we are doing a 101 training, we keep some of the consistent themes and topics that we have to talk about again. So one is starting with a general definition. And you can see some bullet points there on the screen, but essentially money laundering is taking dirty money that was obtained by criminal means and trying to make it look legitimate, hence the washing in money laundering. It is a criminal offense under the Code of Canada, the Criminal Code of Canada, to assist or knowingly assist in money laundering. And under the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act and associated regulations, companies have to take steps to be sure that the businesses they have are not used to launder money. And anytime we do have a suspicion of money laundering, it has to be reported to the regulator. So let's look at money laundering as an example. And essentially, money laundering as I said, is taking the money that is obtained by criminal proceeds and trying to make it look legitimate. It's generally described as having three stages. In the placement stage, this is where the criminal will take usually cash, but not always, and let it enter into the financial system. Then in the layering, the criminal will make several transactions in order to separate the funds from the true crime. And integration is where the criminal proceeds appear to be legitimate. So in this example, there is an example of a gold bar purchase, which is purchased with cash, virtual currency, but it could even be EFT, credit card, etc. The gold bar is transferred to a custodian, but the name is in a nominee, so not the person that's actually purchasing, which basically separates the criminal from the person that is named. Eventually, that gold bar is sold, and then those proceeds are used to purchase property and day-to-day type things that we would normally use. So terrorist financing. So we'll start with a definition of terrorism. And essentially that is the attempt to influence or intimidate the government or public through violence or fear. And terrorist financing essentially is the process of providing financial support for those types of activities to be carried out. So what's the difference between the two? If we look at the difference, the profits always come from crime and money laundering. In terrorist financing, they can come from criminal activities. They may come from legitimate activities as well. A lot of times there have been cases where a charity is set up and society donates to the charity, not realizing that in the background it's being used to fund terrorism. So criminal proceeds always for money laundering, terrorist financing, it could be criminal or legitimate activities. In the laundering stage, money laundering is there's the three stages: placement, layering, integration, and then what the outcome is trying to make the money look legitimate, whereas in terrorism, it is carrying out the act of terrorism. So what is a DPMS? So a dealer in precious metals and precious stones is anyone that buys or sells precious metals, precious stones, or jewelry as part of their business activities. In Canada, you have AML obligations once you've engaged in the purchase of those precious metals, precious stones, or jewelry in the amount of $10,000 or more. And that is in a single transaction. So essentially think about it as you're holding inventory. I've ever held inventory of precious metals, which is gold, silver, palladium, platinum, precious stones, diamonds, sapphires, emeralds, etc. And that includes lab grown as well. So if you've ever held that inventory, a number for those types of materials, you are captured under the regime. There is a carve out for manufacturing, but once you open up to retail sales, you are then captured as well. So here's some questions that we get from time to time, and we just want to kind of clarify, are you a DPMS or not? And sometimes the answer is not really that clear, but it always goes back to that definition that I stated earlier of the $10,000. So I don't accept cash, but I sell jewelry and watches. So the threshold for being caught is not if you accept cash or not. If you accept cash or you don't accept cash, you may be a DPMS. The selling of jewelry and watches may have you captured. So what are those jewelry items and what are those watches? If they are jewelry made out of precious metals and precious stones, you would be captured. The same thing as watches. If they are more, cosmetic and made from plastic, then you're not necessarily captured there. The next one there, I'm a traveling salesperson representing a watch company. I also have a small line of jewelry that I wholesale. So there's kind of two pieces there. The traveling salesperson themselves will not be considered DPMS, but the watch company may, again, depending on the type of quality or what the product is, if it's made from precious metals and precious stones. And the second piece there, while they wholesale, and they're doing, it seems like manufacturing, they sell to retailers, so they would likely be captured under the regime in terms of the small business line. I sell watches, some not very many contain precious metals and precious stones and diamonds sometimes. So most likely that would be captured, again, going back to that $10,000 threshold. And then the last one, I mainly do jewelry repairs. Usually that itself is not captured, but if you have sales of watches and sales of jewelry that are made from precious metals and precious stones, you would be captured. All right, so what is FINTRAC, or who is FINTRAC? So FINTRAC is the Financial Transactions and Reporting Analysis Center of Canada. Essentially, they are the regulator, they are the watchdog, and they make sure the industry follows the law. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what they do in a few coming slides. If you receive any correspondence from FINTRAC, you should escalate it to your compliance officer immediately and not interact with FINTRAC directly. There's sensitivities and timing considerations that have to be considered there. So always escalate as soon as possible to your compliance officer. This is taken from FINTRAC's website. There has been some cases where there's impersonations of FINTRAC. So just be mindful when you do get those communications. FINTRAC is never going to freeze your funds or demand information for the release of such. So kind of keep that in mind. FINTRAC's communications can look different depending on the reason they're communicating with you. Sometimes that is going to be there's questionnaires that they send out. There are what they call monitoring meetings that they would like to set up that just have general questions about what your compliance program looks like. And then there's FINTRAC examinations that usually starts with a phone call and then is followed up by a letter. So FINTRAC does have the mandate and the right under the law to examine your business at any given time. Sorry, go back there. So the examinations can look a little bit different. They can be on-site at a retail location, or they can be desk examinations, so over the phone. And as I mentioned, usually starts with a phone call, and then it follows up with a letter. Usually you have 30 days in which to comply with that letter, and that letter is going to request a bunch of information that FINTRAC would like to see from you. In terms of your examination, those are kind of high-level bullet points of what they are looking for. And basically, they're the implementation of your compliance programs, so your policies, your procedures. Do you have a risk assessment training? And we're going to talk about those a little bit more later. Are you reporting what needs to be? Are you identifying customers when they need to be? And are you keeping various record-keeping obligations in a manner that's retrievable and for the length that they need to be kept for? So what happens if you don't comply? FINTRAC has the authority to administer monetary penalties, known as AMPs, for non-compliance. And there's also criminal penalties that can follow. And any compliance officer that is on this call today, I hope you are subscribed to FINTRAC's mailing list. If you are, you would have noticed and seen AMPs. It's public information, and there's usually a communication to say that a particular company has been fined, what they've been fined for, and the amount of the fine. And here, just a little bit of information more on AMPs. So in 2024, there were 12 AMPs, one of them being $9 million. This one was very large and it was in the news, and you know, we've probably all seen it or heard of it by now. In terms of the way AMPs are administered, there are categories of violations. So you can see there's minor, there's serious, and then there's very serious. And there's calculations related to it. And what I want to point out is per violation. So we're going to go on to an example shortly that talks about suspicious transactions. And suspicious transactions for not filing it is considered a very serious violation. So for every transaction or every report that needed to be sent in as a suspicious transaction, and it wasn't, could carry a fine of up to $500,000 per report. So kind of just think about that and let that settle. The fines can be pretty hefty. So specific to the DPMS sector, we've been lucky. We haven't seen a fine for a while. The last one was in 2023, and it was for $66,000 for 2 violations. Essentially, it looks like the company did not have policies and procedures that describe their obligations under the law and how they comply with it. And then also a risk assessment document, and we'll talk about what those are a little bit more in a little bit. The largest DPMS sector to date has been for just over $200,000, and it was for 4 violations. And here is a list of the 4 violations. So failure to report suspicious transactions, as I mentioned, carries a pretty hefty fine, and that's highlighted because we're going to talk about that. But again, similar to the other one, it didn't look like they had fully developed written policies, procedures, and a risk assessment. And then also failure to maintain a written ongoing compliance training plan. So the particular company did have training, but they didn't have a written ongoing plan. As Alana mentioned earlier, if you're using this for training, you need to record the date, who's taking it, what were the topics covered, and such to make sure that it is, captured as a record keeping under your record keeping obligations related to training. So the 2 bullet points there, and this is public information. So the failure to report suspicious transactions were related to 2 high-end necklace purchases 30 days apart. So the client came in and paid $9,500 in cash both times. So in this instance, $9,500 is just below the reporting threshold, so that should be sending off red flags if somebody's paying that amount of cash. But then also it's 2 high-end necklaces 30 days apart. It does raise suspicion because it wasn't just a one-time occurrence. They've came back a second time. So FINTRAC actually originally was fining the company $500,000 for those missed reports. It was reduced to 165 given it was a first-time offense and the history of compliance with the organization. So let's get into the obligations. So first off is the actual laws that form the AML regime here in Canada. So as I mentioned earlier, there's the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act, and there's associated regulations under that. There is the Criminal Code of Canada, there are ministerial directives, and there are sanctions. Additionally, FINTRAC, the regulator, publishes guidance to make the legislative more digestible and easier to understand. So first off, we'll talk about ministerial directives. There's currently 3 directives, but the main one for the DPMS sector to be of concerned with is the more recent one, which came out in just about a year ago. So the Department of Finance can issue these directives on anything, and really it is related to how to what countermeasures should be applied for transactions coming from certain jurisdictions. This particular ministerial directive is related to Russia. And for the DPMS sector, what needs to happen here is if there is a financial transaction or if there's any importing from Russia, there needs to be additional due diligence that's taken. This includes verifying the identity of any customer or person entity requesting the benefit of the transaction, exercising additional customer due diligence. So in this case, you would ask for things such as source of funds and things of that nature. One important thing to note is if you are importing diamonds from Russia, this ministerial directives makes it prohibited to import diamonds that are equal or greater than 1 carat in size. Sanctions. So sanctions is not something new, but this is an expanded requirement that came in August of last year. So sanctions evasions. Essentially here, if there are reasonable grounds to suspect that there were sanctions evasions, you have to report that to FINTRAC. These lists that are named on the side are lists that contain what is known as listed persons or entities. Previously, they were a list of terrorists and terrorist organizations, but that list has been expanded to sanctions, individuals, and entities now. So it's a larger regime. And essentially, as part of monitoring reporting obligations, as it relates to importing or exporting, if there's any activity in conjunction with a sanctioned individual on these lists, that has to be reported. But for the DPMS sector, something else to consider here is property. There are examples under the definition, under the regulations, but it is pretty broad. So property could mean that you're holding, such as a gold bar for a customer. So if you're holding gold for a person on a sanctions list, there are reporting pieces that go along with that. These lists are updated frequently at no particular intervals, so it's important to keep on top of that and refer to the list as often as possible. Essentially, if you are a larger DPMS, you should have automated processes that do this on a daily basis. So what are your responsibilities under Canadian law? We talk about the compliance program first as having 5 elements or 5 pillars. Essentially, you need to have a compliance officer, which is essentially the person that is responsible for implementing and overseeing the AML program. You need to have policies and procedures in place, and this outlines all your obligations under the law, but then it also describes the processes that you have in place to make sure you're meeting the requirements. The risk assessment essentially is a document that outlines all the ways that your business can be used to launder money, but then all the mitigating controls that are in place to make sure it doesn't happen. And risk assessment is specifically, there's specific factors that have to be assessed, and that's dictated by legislation and by FINTRAC guidance. Compliance effectiveness review essentially is an audit of your AML program, and that has to be done every 2 years. And we're going to talk about that one a little bit more shortly. And then training. Training, what we're doing here today, has to take place at least annually. And while you can take this and use it to meet that obligation, you should have more tailored training based off of the processes that you have in place to implement everything that we're talking about here today. And essentially, that can look different. It can be more formal, such as we're doing here today with a PowerPoint and a recording, but it could also be handing over to your staff your policies and procedures and having them attest to understanding and read that. Keeping your compliance program up to date is something that has to be done under the law. Your policies, your procedures, your risk assessment and training, that should be looked at least annually. And if you are a CGA member and you use the AML toolkit, we do make updates when there are legislative changes there, but it's important for the businesses to realize that this is not a one-time and done document. If there are changes to your business model, you need to look at your compliance programs to see if there needs to be changes to processes or changes in your risk assessment to reflect business changes. The first point there, compliance officer, really when there's a change that needs to be noted, there should be a formal documentation of who the compliancer is, including the date and sign off from management. And then the effectiveness review, as I mentioned, is an audit that happens every 2 years. The compliance effectiveness review essentially will test your AML program. And that's your full program. So your documentation, but as well as your operations. It is not enough to have a checklist and to go through documentation and say, okay, well, I have all my compliance program documents. I'm in compliance. It needs to evaluate the effectiveness of your program and identify where there's potential gaps and weaknesses. And essentially there you are looking at documentation, but going back to legislation and making sure that all the obligations that apply to a DPMS are dictated and outlined in your documentation and have corresponding procedures. But then as well, you are looking at your operations. So you're looking at those transactions and looking at it from a customer identification perspective, Were there triggers of when customers needed to be identified, and was there appropriate record keeping kept as a result of that? There's reporting that has to take place to FINTRAC. We'll talk about that shortly. Were those reports submitted on time? Are they correct? There's record keeping obligations. So are the records kept? Are the records accurate? Are the records kept for as long as they need to be kept? So you're looking at it in its entirety, and it's not just a simple checklist. Ideally, the review should be conducted by somebody that is not directly involved in the compliance activities themselves. And this does get harder when you are a one-person shop because you do everything. The ideal is you go external for something like that. But essentially anybody can do this review so long as they are knowledgeable about the act and the regulations and the AML obligations that would apply to the DPMS sector and your particular business. The last bullet point there, your bank may ask for evidence of such being completed. This is something we have noted happening more and more. So it is important to make sure you're doing your compliance effectiveness review and that you have the appropriate reports that goes along with it. The report actually has to be signed off by management within 30 days of issuance as part of your compliance effectiveness review obligations. Getting into record keeping and reporting, as I mentioned earlier, they have to be retained for 5 years. So if you're not sure if a record is needed for AML purposes and you're about to destroy it, you should contact the compliance officer to make sure records are retained appropriately and as long as they need to be. And then there's reporting to FINTRAC, which we're going to talk about next. So FINTRAC reporting, there's certain types of transactions have to be reported, and all of these reports have specific timeframes in which they need to be sent to FINTRAC. There's certain information that has to be contained in each one of them, and we really don't have the time to go through what that looks like today, but it is important that you're collecting the appropriate information, which really a lot of it is related to customer identification to make sure you're meeting the requirement for customer identification, but then you're also having the information that has to be submitted in these reports. Reporting timelines for FINTRAC. So these are the reports that apply to the DPMS sector for reports to FINTRAC. If you take large cash, and we'll get into what that means shortly, you have 15 days from the transaction date to report that to FINTRAC. If you accept virtual currencies, so that is Bitcoin or similar digital currencies, you have 5 days in which to report that. And your suspicious transactions, which is going to be the one that often applies really to all DPMS sectors. It has to be reported as soon as practicable after determining that there are reasonable grounds to suspect that there's money laundering or terrorist financing. Same thing with attempted suspicious transactions. So the transaction actually doesn't have to be completed, but if there are reasonable grounds to suspect that it is connected to money laundering, terrorist financing, or sanctions evasion, it has to be reported. And then the last one there is the listed person entity property report, which is not a new report, but it is highlighted in green. As I mentioned, it's an expanded report, whereas before this was just really related to terrorist and terrorist property. It is now property for any listed person, which includes terrorist, but also sanctions individuals and entities. Just a note here, many of you will be aware that FINTRAC had a cyber incident last March. Because of that, a lot of systems were taken offline, including the reporting system. So reporting entities, including DPMS entities, were not able to report. FINTRAC introduced a new API interface for reporting shortly after that. But essentially, unless you were high volume, it probably didn't make sense for this to be part or the way that you did reporting. So reports were done through what's called web reporting, and that system came back online a little bit later on, and anybody that had a backlog for reports, so the large cash, the large virtual currency, suspicious transactions, it had to be reported by March 31st, so just a few weeks ago. If you have not reported it for whatever reason, so if you have a backlog of reports and it is not reported, you will want to contact FINTRAC. You may want to do a voluntary self-disclosure of non-compliance. And we can, if that's the situation, please reach out to me and we can have a little chat about that. In some instances, it looks like maybe reporting entities did not have access to the new web reporting system. So if you have reports and you don't have access, you need to reach out to FINTRAC as soon as possible to be able to do those reports. So let's talk about large cash. So large cash is any cash transaction valued at $10,000 or more Canadian dollars, and this can be in a single transaction or multiple transactions within a 24-hour period. If you are a retail chain and you take cash payments, you have to have a mechanism in place to be able to track if David did cash payments between multiple locations, because then that is still caught within that 24-hour window. And I want to make sure this is clear here that cash means cash. It is physical bills, it is coins in any currency, but it does not capture things like checks, bank drafts, or anything of that nature. It also is not meant to capture under the 24-hour rule instances like related to layaway. So, I put some cash down and then I make payments of cash that will equivalent over $10,000, but it's over several months. That is not captured here either. In the cash transaction perspective, when it is over the $10,000 or more, you have to identify a client, and we're going to talk about exactly what that means a little bit later on. Similar to cash, large virtual currency, so again, accepting Bitcoin or something of that nature has the same obligations. And it is okay to tell the customer that you have to do these reports. Sometimes customers may be hesitant to give information, but if they're understanding that this is part of a legislative requirement, they will be more forthcoming to give that information over, so it is fine to tell them that. And just a note here on the 24-hour rule, as I mentioned, if you have multiple locations, there should be a mechanism to track, because the 24-hour rules applies to multiple locations, but across the same person or on behalf of the same person. Third parties. So that relates to my last point of on behalf of someone. And essentially, the concept here is there someone in the background instructing the customer to complete a transaction? This is not meant to capture my partner really likes, a particular ring and I'm buying it for their birthday. They told me what to buy. That's not meant to capture this here. This is situations where essentially someone that you don't know, or even somebody that you know, is asking you to go conduct the transaction on their behalf. And in these cases, you have to collect additional information. This information relates to the third party, so their name, their address, their phone number, and then what is the relationship between the two people. Unusual transactions. So some notes here are, if there is any sort of unusual transaction, it needs to be escalated to the compliance officer for investigation. There is no dollar minimum, and as I mentioned earlier, this could actually be a transaction that took place, but it also could be an attempted transaction. Unlike the large cash and large virtual currency reports, you are not allowed to tell the customer that you are suspicious of them. There's a term called tipping off, which is a criminal offense, so you do not want to tell them that you have suspicion of this could be connected to money laundering or terrorist financing. The stages of suspicion. So kind of as a baseline, it's simple suspicion, and you can kind of think about this as a gut feeling or a hunch. Essentially, if there is that feeling, these are the transactions or situations that should be escalated to the compliance officer immediately. The compliance officer will do an investigation and determine if there's reasonable grounds to suspect. if there is a reason, if there is potential money laundering, terrorist financing, or sanctions evasions, and then they will report that to FINTRAC if there is reasonable grounds, and that is done as soon as practicable for a suspicious transaction, an attempted suspicious transaction. Reasonable grounds to believe is a step above reasonable grounds to suspect. And essentially, this is instances where you know it's connected. So somebody comes in and is buying a gold chain and they say, oh, the funds came from a drug deal I did last week. It's pretty clear there that it is connected to money laundering, that the crime would have been the drug trafficking there, and there are reasonable grounds to believe. So those definitely have to be reported. But going back to the threshold, you don't have to know. The reasonable grounds to suspect is the reporting threshold. So what indicators should I look for in customer behavior? The truth is there's no single behavior all the time that's going to be an indicator of money laundering. I think sometimes we get caught and we're like, oh, well, if they're a criminal, they're probably going to be very aggressive and mean. But that's not always true. A lot of times they're sophisticated and they will, turn the charm on and be flirtatious and become your best friend. So you don't have as much suspicion. So again, it kind of have to just go with that gut feeling off of your interaction with the customer. Did something seem off? Did something not seem right? In those instances, you refer to your compliance officer. What indicator should I look for in the transaction? Again, same thing. Generally, there isn't just always a one and done. This is going to be a suspicious transaction. But some common ones are going to be a customer is not willing to give ID. So going back to that $10,000 in cash, you ask for ID and they don't want to give it to you. That's something that should be escalated to the compliance officer. Or in that instance, they may then say, well, I'm not going to pay cash. I'm going to pay, $9,000 in cash and pay the rest credit card. That is something you would want to escalate to the compliance officer. Um, Also, a consideration is what does your other volumes of cash look like? So if somebody's making a cash payment of $9,000, but your average cash transaction is $200, why is this one so off? And this is, again, something that you would want to escalate to your compliance officer. And yeah, I kind of went through those examples in the bullet points there, but essentially, as I said, those are the examples of when you want to escalate something. There's one example there related to several payments in cash or prepaid cards, and then requesting a refund in a different method shortly after. That could be another unusual transaction that you would want to escalate. Listed person or entity property reports. I talked about this one already, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. When you do have property from a listed person or entity, that has to be reported to FINTRAC as soon as possible. That report is also sent to CSIS and the RCMP. Note, when you have this type of report, you also have to file an STR, so two separate reports in this instance. I've said this already, so timing is of the essence for a lot of these reports. So sending things to the compliance officer as soon as possible is important. If it's your last customer for the day and you're off, don't wait until your shift the next day. You do want to send that as soon as possible so the compliance officer can do the investigation and reach out for additional information to make that determination of if something is reportable or not. And remember, you are protected. So when you report something to the compliance officer and the compliance officer reports that to FINTRAC, it's very unlikely that even if it goes to court, that the customer knows who filed the report. Essentially, the way it works in the background is FINTRAC is sharing information with law enforcement, and that's when certain thresholds have been met. To form evidence, but it doesn't include information like David Vigen submitted that report to FINTRAC. So as long as it's done in good faith, you are protected under the law. We're going to get into identification now. So when does a DPMS have to identify customers? They have to be identified in those situations there. So large cash transactions, so that's that $10,000 or more. Virtual currency transactions, same thing there. And then the suspicious and attempted suspicious transactions. So what does it mean to actually identify a customer? There are different methods. The most common used and probably one of the better methods is the government issued photo identification method. If you're a retail location, this is going to be asking for the customer to hand over a government photo identification document that is authentic, valid, and current. And there's some bullet points there of what the document needs to have on the document to be used. Most common are going to be your driver's license or your passport. And it's okay to accept a foreign jurisdiction's ID document so long as it meets those requirements there. So if it doesn't have a unique identifier on it, you wouldn't be able to use it as an example. And essentially, when it's an in-person interaction, you're looking at that document to make sure you believe that it is authentic. So you're looking at the security markers, you're looking at the features. Does it look like the photo is fake or has been altered? You're looking at all of that to confirm that. And then you're validating the expiry. If the date of the document is expired, you cannot accept it. Health cards. So in general, we recommend not using a health card. In most provinces, you're not able to. You can in Quebec, in some other provinces, but it is probably better to stay away from this and just stick to the other identification documents that I mentioned, passport and driver's license as the examples. There are other methods that can be used to identify a customer. And we're not going to spend too much time on it because they're probably a lot more complex for DPMS sectors, especially in a face-to-face context. If it's related to online transactions, it can be done. The credit file method essentially looks at the Canadian Credit Bureau data for a customer, so it has to be from Equifax or TransUnion. The credit file has to be in existence for 3 years and have 2 different trade lines. And the information you're matching is name, address, and date of birth, and they have to be an exact match. Essentially, while that meets AML requirements for identification, it's not the best fraud measure, so do keep that kind of in mind. And then there's the dual process method, which is usually like a default method that a lot of companies use. And that can be using something like a utility bill and then a bank statement to confirm that the customer has an account with an FI. And then there's agent and mandatories, where essentially if you need to have a written agreement for somebody to use or identify a customer on your behalf using a photo identification document. If you have customers that are organizations, the identification looks a little bit different there, but essentially you're collecting information about the organization, including proof that the organization exists. And then you're going to collect information on directors and the owners of the organization. So for directors, this is a 10% threshold. You're collecting the name of them. But for owners, which is beneficial ownership, 25% or more control in the business, and that's indirect or direct. You do need to get their name and home address there and record the percentage of ownership there. For organizations, you do also need to record if they are not for profit and if they solicit funds from the public. So what happens when identification fails? So I can't confirm for the beneficial ownership for that customer that is an organization. Under the legislation, they have to be considered high risk. They cannot conduct a large cash or large virtual currency transaction, but they may change their method to pay with credit card, and that would be perfectly fine. There's nothing in the legislation that says they cannot complete that transaction. It just cannot be in the form of large cash or large virtual currency. Again, they have to be considered high risk, and what that means is essentially you're doing additional monitoring and due diligence on the customer. Business relationships. This is a unique terminology or phrase that is in our legislation, but essentially it is A customer that has conducted 2 or more activities within a 5-year period that require identification. And essentially, for this, what you would need to do is collect information on why they are doing business with you. And that could be as simple as purchasing jewelry for personal use. But essentially, when you have a business relationship, there's some additional obligations that get triggered, such as monitoring and some other pieces we'll talk about in a second. And one thing to note there, it's 2 or more activities that require identification. So essentially, somebody could be doing a large cash transaction and you think it's suspicious. Even though it's one transaction, there's 2 activities there, right? One is the cash transaction, but then the other activity is the STR, which you have an obligation to do identification. So therefore, you would have a business relationship with that customer. When you have a business relationship, you have to take reasonable measures related to PEP and HIO determinations. And essentially, what this is a politically exposed person or head of an international organization. And the concept there, as these people are in the public, they have access and influence essentially. So they may be potentially targets for criminals to approach. So this is why this determination is there. If a PEP is a foreign PEP, they have to be considered high risk. And as I mentioned, there's some additional obligations when somebody is high risk. If they are domestic, they don't have to be considered high risk, but you do need to do a determination. So you would look at, are they in office? How long they've been in office for? What is their position? And determine if they should be high risk or low or medium risk. And the same is for head of an international organization. So what is a foreign PEP? Those are some examples on the screen there, but a judge from the UK would be considered a foreign PEP. One important thing to note is even after the person leaves their position, they are considered a foreign PEP for life, and therefore need to be considered high risk. Examples of domestic there. Going back to that judge example, they would be, if they were a judge here in Canada, they're only a PEP for up to 5 years after they left office or if they passed away. But essentially there, you're doing a risk assessment, and after 5 years that they left the position, they're no longer considered a PEP. And there's just a definition of what a head of an international organization is. So you're making a determination, and the determination can be done by asking the client directly or the customer in front of you. They can also be more automated solutions in the background with various tools that are out there. So we're getting into the last section here, which is some additional considerations and upcoming changes. And I'm going to start with some upcoming changes, which just went in a couple of weeks ago. Legislation passed a couple of weeks ago, or became final, I should say. So the first bullet point there, essentially, there is a new regulation under the Proceeds Crime Money Laundering Terrorist Financing Act. So the regulation is called the Proceeds Crime Money Laundering Terrorist Financing Reporting of Goods Regulation. But essentially, this is important for anyone in the DPMS sector that does imports and exports. Essentially, under this new regulation, when you import or export goods, there's a declaration with the CBSA that has to be filled out. And essentially, you're attesting to, were these goods involved or potentially related to money laundering, terrorist financing, or sanctions evasions. So there's a new requirement there if you are importing and exporting that you should be aware of. The second one there is something that is voluntary, but essentially for entities to share information between other organizations, there's privacy considerations. So it wasn't so easy to share information back and forth. So an example is, you knew David Vijan came in and you filed an STR on him and there's certain information. You could potentially share that information with other regulated entities now. And what that looks like is you actually have to come up with a code of conduct. The code of conduct has to go to the Privacy Commissioner of Canada for approval. And then once that is approved, you are able to share information. Sorry, moved forward too fast. But yeah, so going back to that, there is time frame in which the OPC has to respond, which I believe is 120 days. And then you're able to share that information. And then the last one there is not enforced yet, but comes in October. Essentially, if you are an organization that uses the Canadian Business Corporations Act for any reason, you have to report discrepancies back on and beneficial ownership under the current AML regime. So material discrepancies are not fully defined within it. So there's going to be a little bit of a risk-based approach, but essentially that is coming in October of this year. Just being mindful of time, I'm going to quickly run through this one, but I wanted to raise this point of de-risking, which is also known as debanking. It's become more prevalent in the DPMS sector. And the truth is, this is something that exists for all regulated entities. I think we're just seeing it more in the DPMS sector now. So can my bank close my account without warning? Yes, they can at any time. Often they will give you warnings, they will give you notices, but the reality is they can do that. If you get a request from your bank for certain information, do not ignore that request. Take that seriously. You also may want to consider having backup alternatives. So not just having one bank account, but having another account just in case that gets closed off. A lot of times what the bank is going to be looking for is related to your AML regime. So do you have policies and procedures, risk assessment, training in place? Have you done your effectiveness review every 2 years as you're legally obligated to do? And we understand that, in past they may not have asked for this, but the reality is the landscape has changed significantly and it has to be taken more seriously. Unfortunately, I think sometimes the request, you get busy, you just don't respond, and unfortunately there's sometimes downstream effects from that. Canada's mutual evaluation. I'm not going to really spend much time here because we can spend a lot of time here, but essentially, this is an evaluation of the AML regime in Canada by the FATF, so Financial Action Task Force. And essentially, you can think of it as an international body that compares countries to compliance requirements. Essentially, they publish a report and then say how good or bad Canada is doing. The review is going to commence in late 2025, so we will see reports in 2026. And essentially what happens is anytime there is these evaluations, there's substantial amounts of regulation changes. So we've experienced a lot of changes over the last couple of years. Some of them just coming in a few weeks ago. We're going to experience more. So make sure you're staying on top of your AML obligations and those for using the AML toolkit through the CGA. We do update that material anytime there is regulatory change, but that is something you also want to update related to any business changes. And I think with that, we're very short on time, but I think we have a few minutes, 5 minutes for some questions.
Thank you so much, David. I'll just stop the recording here.